Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and today I watched 2021's Werewolves Within. Excuse me. This one's a doozy, not for any of the reasons you might necessarily think, though. I have as much, if not more, to say about everything that surrounds this movie than I do about the movie itself. But we're gonna pick this thing apart. So Werewolves Within. I'm gonna break the news right off the bat, because it's possibly the most fascinating thing about this movie, that this is based on a video game. Now, I didn't realize that until I was in the opening credits and I saw the Ubisoft logo and I went, oh, hold on a minute. So I looked it up, and it's made by, apparently, Ubisoft now has a dedicated movie studio, as of the horrific thing I never watched, but some people did, the Assassin's Creed movie. They founded a proper movie studio. This is their second movie. And apparently they have 6 more planned. I'm just going to read off the Wikipedia page here because I don't know. You all have to digest this with me. Upcoming films: Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon, Tom Clancy's The Division, Rabbids, Just Dance, Beyond Good and Evil, and Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Possibly the most upsetting thing is the Beyond Good and Evil, because they've been promising a sequel to that game for, 15 years now, and they keep teasing us with what look like good trailers, and then they don't make games. And here's the part where I remind everyone that, hey, Ubisoft is a terrible company. It abuses its workers and allows and protects abusers within its ranks. So, yeah, fuck Ubisoft. Or Ubisoft, whichever one it is. I don't care. Fuck them. So, yeah. Anyway, back to the film. Werewolves Within, which is a name I hate because it's werewolves plural, is based on a video game that Ubisoft made in what year was it? Hold on. It was like 2016, I think. I'm not going to bother looking it up. That I didn't have any knowledge of. It is a VR game that is based on the game Werewolf, which is then based on the game Mafia, which are very informal. The lattermost of which are very informal games. They're not video games. They're just games you play. They have no. Well, in some cases, like they were first turned into, like, Werewolf was turned into a board game. Some people may be familiar with the board game Ultimate Werewolf, which is basically just an adaptation of these older rules of informal games that, go back much, much longer. So it's very bizarre to me, although entirely unsurprising at some level, that Ubisoft decided to make a VR game out of it at some point in the recent past. So they made a movie out of it, and that seems like a really good idea, because for those of you who are familiar with Werewolf, it's a very simple game. The premise is that there is a town. Most of the people in the town are normal, but some of them are werewolves secretly. And there's some other people in the town who have special jobs and special abilities, and you During the night, the werewolves will kill somebody, and then other people will also, who have special jobs, also do their jobs. There's a lot that you could potentially write. Really interesting. Like, it's a very open framework for building a story. Unfortunately, this movie doesn't do much with it. So, yeah, this is more than anything else a case of squandered opportunity. Now, that's not to say that there's anything super wrong with the film. It's just there are so many stories that you can tell with such an open framework that it's really disappointing to see the execution quite the way it is. And that's not even to necessarily say that I think this film is like terrible or something like that. It's not. It's very middle of the road. If you just wanted to throw something on and have a time, you could do far worse than this. It is largely inoffensive. But knowing the connections there in the of the games and so on, it just, while I was watching, had me literally writing scripts in my head of like, how would I write this? How would I write something? How would I fix this scene? How would I fix this arc? How would I fix this character? How would I write this differently to be more intriguing? And that's really the biggest disappointment here, is that I feel like a lot of opportunity is squandered to like explore character and the dynamics of a community. So before we get into like the proper content of the film, I think I should talk about the actors, because if there is one thing that does sort of stand out as quality, it is some of the acting. Not all of it, and certainly none of it is done favors by some of the issues with the script. But there are some performances here that I do feel like calling out. Sam Richardson, for one, is so the two leads in the two big air quotes leads ostensibly in the film are Sam Richardson and Miliana Vintrub, I believe is how she pronounces her last name. Sam Richardson is somebody who I looks really familiar, but I have not watched. Well, okay, so Sam Richardson has a long career, but mostly in fairly minor roles. He's had a whole bunch of TV spots as like minor one-off characters in speaking roles. He was also apparently a major character in Veep, which is a show I am interested in watching. Connection backwards to Armando Iannucci, who we talked about with The Death of Stalin. He was, I don't know if he's the primary writer on Veep, but anyway, I digress. Anyway, Sam Richardson was apparently a character on that show. That seems to be one of his major credits prior to this. But other than that, largely he has like a 10-year career of mostly having minor roles. That said, I think he does a really good job in this film. Given what he's given, the script is a problem. We'll get back to that. The other ostensible lead, Miliana, is okay. We need to talk about Miliana because she has become a bit of a sensation on the internet, mostly due to being, you may not know her name, but you may know her work as, quote, AT&T girl. For a number of years, Miliana was the like sort of character representative of AT&T in their advertising. In the same way as I don't remember what her character's name was, big air quotes character in the AT&T ads, but it was a similar kind of role to like Flo in Progressive ads and those sorts of things. It was, a recurring character that showed up in the ads, and it's a clever marketing gimmick. Anyway, I digress on that, but that is what she largely came to be known for, which I think is a shame because I knew her before that when she and her friend Stevie, I think is her name, once upon a time, several years before, not many years before, had a show on YouTube, or a channel on YouTube called Live Prude Girls. And that show is fantastic. I haven't watched much of it in ages, but I did go back and watch an episode between this and between watching the movie and this. It's weird and bizarre, very dry, slightly awkward comedy, and it's wonderful, and I love it very much. So she's a comedian in her own right, and like really, I think it's a disservice that people know her as AT&T Girl. Clearly, she's known as that character because she has talent. You don't just attach yourself to a random advertisement character unless they have something else going on. And she is extremely talented in her acting chops. She articulates so much in her face and her body, and like subtle inflections in her voice and all these other things that like she has an incredible talent for putting on a character, whatever that character may be. That's very evident in Live Prude Girls. It's I haven't watched, I think I maybe have seen a few of the ads, but like, I haven't watched those extensively, deliberately, because why would I do that? But she's got talent, and I knew that before this. It is interesting to see her in a proper leading role by all accounts. And she does put on a good show. Again, problems with the script, and just being a kind of a cluttered mess, but she's a compelling character and very enjoyable to watch on screen. There are a number of more minor characters, not a lot of like minor characters, which kind of run the gamut. It's really hard to say much about them, again, because of the script. So at this point, we have to talk about the script. The script is boring. That's basically the gist of it. The script doesn't have a lot of content. It has a lot of fluff. And the fluff is very, I hesitate to say one-dimensional, but there are ways to write it when you're working with something like Werewolf, where you're talking about, these tropified roles that you can work with in various different ways. There are ways to adhere to tropes and still make them interesting and nuanced. What is interesting here is there are some good aspects here. It doesn't fall flat on its face. As far as the character tropes go, there are some characters who are really sort of to the T, the trope. There are some that are sort of subtly subverted, and there are others that are completely sort of turned on their heads. And on the whole, the core idea of this sort of modernization of the typically Werewolf is set in a more sort of pre-industrial society type of thing. So modernizing it is like a really interesting opportunity to do a lot with it. And they do some things with it, but not enough and not very subtly. And in particular, there are some standout moments of like, okay, you made this movie in 2020, you made this movie in the modern era in the last few years, and you wrote some stuff trying to appeal to sort of the, for want of a better phrase, woke crowd, and you were trying to use, delicacy, and you didn't. You used a hammer. There's some stuff that's pretty on the nose and not unwelcome in theory, just sort of not very well done. So is a mixed bag on that front. As far as the actual dialogue goes, that's where some of the larger problems lie, and not because the dialogue itself is really a huge problem, it's what it means for the rest of the story. So I think what's most notable for me as I was watching it is that I was struggling to keep up with what was going on and who was leading a scene and what the intention of a scene was, which are sort of fundamentals of screenwriting, that between the beginning and an end of a scene there should be some progress, or some clear development, and a lot of the scenes, despite pretty clearly not being ad-libbed, I highly doubt that a lot of the stuff was ad-libbed. It's a little too stilted for that. A lot of it is sort of fluff, like as though that the writer is trying to get across sort of deeper character, in the sense of having the characters act out who they are. And it's not the most ham-fisted thing, but it's just not very well done. And they all do it at once. Large portions of the film have a whole bunch of characters in a scene at the same time, and they're all interacting with one another in sort of an ensemble way. But ensemble writing requires a very sort of deft hand to not mangle it. And there's just scene after scene where it's like there's 3, 4, 5 people talking at the same time. And I went back after to check a few of them, and they're all saying fluff, not meaningful. Like it. Initially, I was sort of impressed because it came off a lot more sort of naturalistic in its tone of like, oh, these are real people and they're not, waiting for each other to stop talking. They're interrupting each other and those sorts of things, which something I think is a great, often missing in a lot of screenwriting. But this sort of goes the other way, where it appears like that at first until you realize, oh no, you just wrote a bunch of attempts at synthesized character development for each character to deliver, and they're like delivering at the same time, and it's unclear what the point of the scene is. And sometimes that gets resolved by the end of the scene, and the end of the scene ends with some development. Other times it's just like, I don't know what that was about. I don't feel like I gained anything. I don't understand the characters better. I don't understand the situation better. I don't, the course of the movie has not evolved. So that all adds up to a bit of a mess, because that really runs over the course of the film as a whole. There is something to be said for, especially when you are comparing it with the game, playing the game Werewolf, which, if you've ever played it before, does tend to devolve into chaos. But again, the dialogue comes off as stilted, and there's still not for all the free form of it, Werewolf is still a heavily structured game, in terms of there are clear beats. You all argue, then you vote, then you go to sleep. And then the events overnight happen. But this movie doesn't capitalize on that opportunity to have those like clear beats of what the next step is. Things just sort of happen. Like you'll be unsurprised. This, I don't feel like this is a spoiler. At some point, they board up a building, and you're like, okay, that makes sense, but also why? And you go back to the scene prior, and it's like, you guys didn't really discuss this. You just sort of concluded that it was the right thing to do without any discussion. All of the prior arguing was unrelated. So, yeah, it ends up being a bit of a disappointment in that front. This is, in theory, a comedy horror film, and the very first chunk of the film and the very last chunk of the film, I think, actually do that pretty well. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the tone and the mix of comedy and horror, which we've seen in a number of other films I've covered on the channel so far, doesn't work that well. So in addition to all the sort of dialogue and script like pacing issues, it also has some tonal problems. So while in a good comedy horror, the comedy and horror sort of feed into each other or subvert each other or work in sort of this beautiful synthesis to give you something more than either one could give you individually. In this film, I really feel like more often than not, they were undercutting each other. So you have comedy beats that are undercutting the horror aspects, and horror portions of it that are sort of not built up at all because of the comedy predecessor. And so overall, it's just sort of, it's not well mixed. And again, that's kind of disappointing. It's not awful, but it's just not that great either. There's a lot of, like I said, I can't get over the fact that I think there's so much opportunity here. And even with, the same cast and the same set pieces even and all that. But just, it needs a lot of reworking. Admittedly, I don't know how much of this script was mangled by corporate, poking and prodding, especially Ubisoft, who has a long history of undercutting its the work of the artists, basically. So it wouldn't entirely surprise me if that was the case here yet again. But it's a bit of a mess. Since it is a movie, we have to talk about the visual aspect of it, and it's not great. In addition to having some visual elements that are sort of Chekhov's gun on steroids, that are just like, yes, we get it. You've shown it 3 times. We get it. We get what you're foreshadowing or whatever, or the implication for the following scene. In addition to all that, there's just some fundamental problems with the cinematography and the directorship. So in particular, the lighting is a very serious problem throughout basically the entire film. The first portion of the film sort of escapes it. The first, I want to say 20 minutes. And after that, it is just dark. Way too dark. All of the time. And I think the reason for that is that they were going for a very natural look in the context of what the story called for. But sometimes you have to make artistic concessions against realism and for artistry and for visibility. And so there are serious portions of this film where I can barely see what's going on, where the actors are very ill lit, where it's just a mess on screen, and not a lot positive to say there. And especially when you compare it to something like, what was the name of that film? I watched it on the channel. Hold on. I'm going to be very embarrassed that I didn't remember this. It was one of the early films I watched. Ready or Not. That was it. In comparison to Ready or Not, which has a lot of sort of similar elements, both in the like sort of comedy horror aspect, and some of the visual aspects, and all these other things. Ready or Not, by comparison, I think does a much better job in a variety of ways. Obviously, it's a different story, different context, different sort of overall tone, but the comparison, I think, is pretty clear. So seeing people work well with light versus poorly with light, good and bad cinematography, like it's a bit of a disappointment. Which is, I guess I'm just going to keep saying that about this film. In a lot of ways, it feels amateurish, and I don't even necessarily hold that against the filmmakers, because this does seem to have been, there is no disclosed budget. Allegedly, it was in the like $5 to $6 million range, but yeah. So it has some money, but not a huge amount of money behind it. It also has some fairly small names attached to it. So the director, Josh Rubin, also has not a lot of credits to his name. I think this may be his only feature film credit. He has a bunch of individual episodes of TV shows he's shot before, but I think this is the only. He doesn't have a Wikipedia page, but he does have an IMDb, so that sort of gives you a sense of the level of notoriety that he has. So I don't know. Maybe it's a matter of difference in experience in the two different-ish media. But yeah, it's just not a pretty film. There's enough cinematography that is differentiated in its styling and framing and these other things. There's some individual scenes that I actually really like. But on the whole, a lot of it is sort of unpleasant. So, yeah. Overall, I really want to like this film. There's a whole lot potentially going for it, but the overall execution is just largely disappointing. Now, if you just wanted something dumb to put on for 95 minutes, I think is the runtime, yeah, you could do way worse than this. It's, it is interesting enough, good enough that I would not dissuade anybody. Like, somebody asked me, should I watch this? I wouldn't really hesitate. If they were already interested in it, I wouldn't tell them no, and I wouldn't hesitate to say, yeah, sure, why not? 95 minutes, whatever. It's not great. It's fine. Just a lot of the other external attachments to me sort of make me wish that this had more opportunity to shine, and also that it wasn't made by Ubisoft. Fuck those guys. So anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. It's almost 2 a.m. I've had an entire bottle of wine, and I will see you guys next time. Ah.